Joining us on this conversation, we have David Coltart, former Minister of Education, Sports and Culture, Zimbabwe. And we also have Mwanase Ahmed. She's coordinator, Pan-African Solidarity Network in Kilifi, Kenya. Thank you so much, gentlemen. All right, I'm told that we have a third guest, Professor Talent Rusere, Southern African Human Rights Lawyers High Commissioner in Harare, Zimbabwe. Thank you so much for joining us at this time. So let me begin with David. David, Cyril Ramaphosa moved this briefing behind closed doors instead of putting it on the open agenda, yet publicly declared that he was deeply concerned and ashamed of how foreign nationals have been treated. But beyond expressing shame, what concrete policy shifts, is Pretoria offering SADC leaders who are currently receiving thousands of traumatized, displaced citizens back home?
So obviously in the public domain, it's not clear what they are offering SADC leaders. Our concern relates to the push factors, and it's not so much the policy decisions that the South African government makes regarding the internal situation in South Africa. There, the rule of law must prevail, and those who are illegally threatening and in some cases murdering residents from surrounding countries should face the full wrath of the law. But our concern is, as I say, the push factors. The reality is that the vast majority of illegal immigrants to South Africa come from Zimbabwe and Mozambique, and to a lesser extent from other countries in Africa. And once again, the reality behind that is that the economic conditions, the political conditions are very poor in both Mozambique and Zimbabwe. And that has caused, in Zimbabwe's case, over the last 20 years, for hundreds of thousands of Zimbabweans to seek economic and political exile in South Africa. And it's critical that the South African government recognizes that it can no longer continue turning and looking the other way when in Zimbabwe and Mozambique and in other countries there are flagrant breaches of the rule of law. There's rampant corruption. The economies are in great trouble. There are very high numbers of people out of formal employment. And unless we get to grips with what is going on in the internal affairs of those countries, it doesn't matter what internal policy South Africa adopts, we will still see this flood of illegal immigrants coming into South Africa.
All right. Now, speaking of, South African government no longer, looking the other way, let me pass the next question to Mwanase. Vigilante groups like March and March staged protests right outside the Durban summit venue, your people, giving neighboring states a September deadline for mass deportations. Has the South African state effectively lost control of its migration narrative, to grassroots vigilantes? And how much real political weight does a movement that size carry in Pretoria right now?
It's also really important to look at the current political context in South Africa at the moment, with it being an election year for the local government elections on November 4th. And after the ANC has fallen to less than 40% in the national election and lost its parliamentary majority, immigration is a really sensitive issue from an electoral perspective. So I think what's happening is, the state still controls all of the legal machinery, but it's surrendering its political and social authority and trying to, it understands that the immigration issue is sensitive from an electoral perspective, and therefore failing to prioritize and, protect from and step in from a human rights and from a legal and lawful perspective. So these vigilante groups thrive where governments are actually failing to deliver services, reduce inequality, and create economic opportunity and maintain public trust. So groups like March and March then occupy that vacuum, showing themselves as alternative enforcers and trying to use migration and migrants as a scapegoat for a failing public services. And ultimately, I think this is something that's also happened in other places as well, where these migrants are being used as an excuse for lack of delivery. So ultimately, I think this vacuum has arisen for these vigilante groups to thrive, and there's lack of concrete action due to also the electoral sensitivity.
All right, let me come to Professor Rusere, because protesters, we do know, claim that they are targeting illegal immigration, yet documented workers, legitimate asylum seekers, and foreign-owned small businesses regularly end up in the crosshairs. Now, let's also talk about, the fact that South Africa is asking for reimbursements, from some African countries for repatriation costs, which this actually was on the table, and then it was quietly taken off it. Do you have an idea what happened in that room and who blocked it and why, it didn't pass, why they didn't speak on it?
First and foremost, before I get to comment on your exact question, I think it's very important and imperative for Africa to realize that whatever that is happening in South Africa, the xenophobia that is happening in South Africa, is no longer simply a South African foreign policy question. SADC itself recognizes that geopolitical rivalry outside Africa, and it's increasingly affecting the economic, security, and diplomatic environment of the Southern Africa. So basically, we must treat the situation that is in South Africa on the basis of a clear understanding that whatever that is happening in South Africa, it's not something that should be domesticated in a way that will be saying South Africa has failed to control its citizens and so forth, because there are bigger issues and bigger political players infiltrating the South African politics, using the loopholes that are in South Africa, using the failures of the South African government in terms of service delivery and so forth. So for South Africa to be claiming compensation of the funds that they used during the repatriation processes, I think it's absolute negative, and it's not anything that can be commended, that should be commended. South Africa should understand that its politics has been infiltrated, and if you look at it, you will come to understand that this is not the first time that South Africa is facing this kind of a crisis. It once happened even during the apartheid. When they were fighting the apartheid, the South African secret police used to fund blacks against blacks. And whenever issues like this or crises like this arise, it should show us as an African continent that there is an enemy outside our borders, trying to weaken African solidarity, trying to disintegrate the African unity, so that we'll end up having these conversations where we will be saying South Africans are doing this to other Africans, there is Afrophobia, there is this, there is that. And I believe it is very important for the South African government to clearly investigate this kind of interference, not on the basis of trying to control their domestic issues, but we as Africa need to chip in and help South Africa fight this kind of interference.
Okay. Now, let me still pass this question to you before I move back to David, because Zimbabwe and Mozambique are said to be resisting South Africa's push, to bring the SADC free movement protocol directly to the leaders. So can you explain to us, what's at stake if that protocol for ordinary citizens, on both sides of the border?
Okay. What is important is South Africa itself alone cannot achieve the goal. And it's very important when we are looking at issues like this that affect us as an entire African continent. We need to be very careful with how we handle them. And I believe that this will help not only South Africa and not only the outsiders from South Africa. This will be a very relevant move to make sure that as an African continent, we reintegrate our people together. We try to push for the spirit of Ubuntu, and this will benefit us economically, not only political leaders, but it will also benefit the citizens themselves. Because whenever we allow open borders and whenever we allow such movements, we are simply creating more employment, we are simply creating more opportunities, we are sharing ideas, we are sharing expertise, we are promoting businesses. And I believe to a greater extent, it will benefit everyone else.
All right, so let me come back to David now. David, Ghana and Nigeria, both outside the SADC bloc, publicly criticized how South Africa handled this crisis. So why is criticism landing harder from West Africa than from, South Africa's own regional neighbors? And how significantly does this violence damage Pretoria's moral authority and diplomatic standing on the broader African continent?
Well, I need to stress I'm obviously not in South Africa, and I don't.
I know you're in Zimbabwe.
Yeah, and I don't have knowledge, on the ground regarding the type of xenophobia displayed. So this is just speculation on my part, but I think it's due to a combination of factors. I think, first of all, one needs to understand that if you take Zimbabweans, for example, they assimilate much better into South Africa than, say, Ghanaians and Nigerians. In the case of Ndebele-speaking people from Zimbabwe, they come from KwaZulu-Natal originally, and the Ndebele language is very close to Zulu, and there are obviously Ndebele's in South Africa. So they blend in and are harder to identify, whereas Ghanaians and Nigerians and perhaps people from the DRC are very obviously different and can be more obviously targeted. So I suspect that there's a much higher percentage of Ghanaians and Nigerians and perhaps people from the DRC who've been identified and assaulted and brutalized. And that may have led to the Ghanaian and Nigerian governments being so strident. I think a second reason is because there is an understanding that in the case of Zimbabwe, that our own policies have contributed towards what has happened in South Africa. It's because of the hyperinflation in Zimbabwe in the last 2 decades. It's because of the economic chaos. It's because of the collapse of industry in Zimbabwe that so many Zimbabweans have flooded out to South Africa. And to that extent, we are complicit. And that might have led to a more muted response from our government, whereas the same charge cannot be leveled against the Ghanaian and Nigerian governments from, say, the Zimbabwean government.
All right, let me, Mwanase, let's talk about the fact that citizens from neighboring countries like Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Mozambique make up the vast majority of those who, are fleeing South Africa. So how do these mass exoduses affect the economies, of these SADC neighbors, particularly with respect to, remittances, and the likes? How does it affect the economies, their economy, local stability?
Thank you. If it's okay, I just want to add one thing on the previous
Please
question,
go ahead.
because I also think that it's really important to recognize that diplomatic relationships, when you're looking at southern region countries, tend to prioritize the elite interests instead of the people's interests. And a lot of the neighboring countries and neighboring governments also depend a lot on South African trade, investment, and employment opportunities. So they, even when their citizens are being, drastically affected and degraded and violated, they're less likely to speak up when it might challenge their own personal interests as well. So I think Ghana and Nigeria have bigger distance in terms of like their diplomacy and their ability to speak more truthfully and more forcefully, because they don't have the same negative repercussions from an economic perspective as the neighboring countries. So maybe willing to raise their voices more significantly. I think there may be more to consider beyond just assimilation or other issues in terms of who is willing to speak more honestly, vocally, and accurately to speak out against the injustices and what's been happening in South Africa for their own citizens, rather than protecting their own interests. I think ultimately the exodus is very challenging for many different reasons, because the vulnerability of those migrants often begins before they get to South Africa. So then after facing exclusion and violence and going back to countries that may also not be able to provide employment, healthcare, education, or other types of support is, a further chain of state failure, and the loss of remittances and economic strain would certainly increase poverty and, impact foreign currency inflows, and it'll put additional pressure on basic services, jobs, houses, school, elements that are already under strain in other countries as well. So I think we must remember that receiving people at a border is not the same as reintegrating them. And I don't think any government would have necessarily been prepared for this type of occurrence.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I actually wish we had more time. I didn't know that time had actually run so fast. David Coltart, former Minister of Education, Sports and Art and Culture in Zimbabwe. We've also had Professor Talent Rusere, a Southern African human rights lawyer, High Commissioner in Harare, Zimbabwe, and also Mwanase Ahmed, Coordinator, Pan-African Solidarity Network in Kilifi, Kenya. Thank you so much, gentlemen and lady, for gracing us with your presence.